Hello, this presentation introduces you to organic compounds and their features, as well as how they are made or synthesized and how they're broken down. It is intended for students that are taking Anatomy and Physiology 1 at Madison College. So what do we mean at all when we say organic compound? What does it refer to in the context of studying the human body? Well, it's a molecule present in the body that's composed of a carbon framework. And to that framework are attached functional groups. These groups of atoms that make up functional groups impart some characteristic to the entire organic compound. Perhaps it makes the compound more acidic or alkaline or polar or nonpolar. So on this picture, on this slide, you can see a picture of a carbon atom with the pink and gray nucleus and the blue electrons orbiting the nucleus. That's carbon. When many carbons are strung together to form a complex compound, that's an organic compound. So here we've got three carbon framework with added to it many hydrogens, which is typical of any organic compound, and a functional group. And this particular functional group is called a carboxyl group. I don't expect you to understand that yet or recognize it, but we will get to it. So any organic compound contains a framework of carbons with a functional group attached, or maybe more than one functional group. Now there are four main types or categories of organic molecules found in the body. They consist of carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. There are four different individual categories of organic molecules. Now these categories probably sound somewhat familiar to you because if you've ever read a nutrition label, you have seen lipid, but they don't say lipid, they say fat. And there's cholesterol, which is another lipid. They usually in a nutritional label give a total carbohydrate and a protein. The only thing that's really missing are these nucleic acids right here, and that's because nucleic acids are eaten in such small quantities that they're not really considered a nutrient. We don't get energy from them. So here are some more practical examples of each of the types of organic molecules. So for carbohydrates, we'll start with one of the main ones found in your body is glucose. That's found in your blood as well as your cells and basically every tissue that you have. And glucose is something that we need to keep in tight regulation because the cells use that for quick energy. Another type of carbohydrate is called glycogen, and it's a way that your liver stores carbohydrate. Some common lipids that you've probably heard of include cholesterol and triglycerides. Those two are two of the lipids that are frequently measured through blood work, just to make sure that your arteries and vessels are healthy. And then another type of lipid is called a phospholipid. That's what makes up all of your cell membranes. So we'll talk about what phospholipids do for us at a later point. Some common proteins that you've heard of, I'm sure, include enzymes, because we just talked about that in a different lecture. Antibodies are proteins. And then, of course, your muscles are made up of protein. Now, nucleic acid might sound new and vague and kind of strange, but you've heard of a nucleic acid, and that's DNA. So DNA is our hereditary molecule. It gets passed on from generation to generation, and it is one example of a nucleic acid. There are 3 others that we'll encounter later in the semester called ATP, NADH, and RNA. So you'll become more familiar with those as time progresses, over weeks, not just within this lecture. So, organic compounds are composed of a carbon framework with functional groups attached. And there's many different functional groups. We're going to look at a few of them. And the purpose at looking at functional groups is that if you can recognize a functional group, you can usually categorize the type of compound you're looking at. For example, carbohydrates have a lot of this functional group, the hydroxyl group. And on the next slide, amino acids have this amine group, and nucleic acids have a phosphate group. So what we're going to do first is we're just going to look at functional groups, and I'll point out what's the most helpful for you to become aware of, and then we'll do a little activity. So the first functional group listed up there is the hydroxyl group. It's prevalent in all carbohydrates, and due to the presence of oxygen, due to the presence of oxygen, a hydroxyl group makes carbohydrates polar. Remember, oxygen is always electronegative, so you get these partial polar bonds, partially charged atoms. And because hydroxyl groups make a compound polar, that compound likes water. It's hydrophilic, because remember, water is also polar. The second functional group shown is a methyl group, or CH3. In a methyl group, there are many carbon-hydrogen bonds, actually 3 of them, and in general, any carbon-hydrogen bond is nonpolar. Therefore, any compound that has a functional methanol group, or a methyl group, which is a type of functional group, is considered nonpolar. The third category, or type of functional group, is called a carboxyl group, and we usually say it quickly as COOH. So COOH. But it's not linear. So the carbon in this functional group is double bonded to one of the oxygens and single bonded to a hydroxyl group. We find carboxyl groups in amino acids, sugars, and proteins in general. But because there's oxygen, what's the most important for you is to know that a compound that has a carboxyl group is probably polar because of the presence of oxygen. Therefore, it likes water, it's hydrophilic. So the next group of functional groups is the amino group, and it includes 1 nitrogen bound to 2 hydrogens. Now, on the surface, there's no oxygen, so you don't think polar, but that nitrogen actually has 2 electrons that aren't bound to anything, just attached to the nitrogen, not bound to the hydrogen. So this electron pair imparts a partial negative charge to the nitrogen atom, and therefore we say that there's a polarity in an amine group. And so any compound that has an amine group we would consider hydrophilic, liking water, because it's polar. And then the last type of functional group that we'll ever see is a phosphate group. It's pretty complex if you look at it. It's the biggest one. It always has a central phosphate surrounded by oxygens, and the oxygens, some of them have a hydrogen attached. The main thing about characteristics is that, again, you've got oxygens here. So those oxygens make anything that has a phosphate group polar or hydrophilic. The place that we find these will be in nucleic acids primarily. We may see one at some point on an amino acid in a protein, but usually it doesn't change any characteristic because an amino acid is already polar anyway. Okay, let's take a couple of minutes and identify the functional groups in each one of these compounds. I just want you to look at the slide and see if you can see the carbon framework, which is pretty small in all of these cases, not very long or extensive, and the functional groups, mainly the functional groups. So I'll take ethanol first, and I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. So here's ethanol, and I see 2 carbons, and here's my functional group, a hydroxyl group. Okay, now take a look at acetic acid. This is a new thing for you, I'm sure, because it's drawn in a kind of an organic chemistry shorthand that you won't be familiar with, and that is that every time you see a corner, 2 lines that join, for example, right here, okay, that's where a carbon is located. So automatically you know that there is a carbon right there. So that's our carbon framework. And I see, well, this is our carbon framework, sorry. This is our carbon framework. This is actually a functional group, COOH. I think that one's really hard. I wouldn't test you with that particular picture. That one's too hard. And then let's go down to methylamine. It is only made up of 2 functional groups. See if you can name them. On the left is an amine group, and on the right is a methyl group. And then the last picture, bottom right, shows a pretty complex compound called glycerol 3-phosphate. And the carbon framework or backbone are these 3 carbons. The functional groups that you see include this hydroxyl group, and then that phosphate group. Okay, let's look at this exercise and see if this makes sense to you. I just want to ask you what the name of each one of these functional groups is. So when you have carbon bound to 3 hydrogens, what is the functional group called? You should be familiar with that. And the answer is methyl. How about OH? What is that functional group? Hydroxyl. And then this one, phosphate with 4 oxygens around it. That's not very hard. That's a phosphate group, right? I think number 4 is the hardest one. COOH. What's that functional group? Carboxyl. And then when you have a nitrogen attached to 2 hydrogens in number 5, what's that one called? An amino group. So all of the answers to these questions are in the notes section of the slides, so that you can go back and you can review this over and over again if you need to, or just print out the answers. Okay, so we're going to move beyond functional groups and now talk about organic compounds in general. So organic compounds consisting of a carbon framework are also called polymers because they are made up of many subunits. Poly meaning many, meric meaning a subunit. So this, for example, is a schematic drawing of an organic compound that has some repeating subunits joined together. Each one of those little balls is considered a monomer. So although there are differences between the four categories of organic macromolecules, there's also this similarity, and that is that they are all polymers made up of many monomeric subunits. In addition, all of the categories of macromolecules, organic macromolecules, are synthesized in the same way. And that is that monomers are added in a chain by the same chemical process. The chemical reaction is called dehydration synthesis. And a monomer is added to a chain of monomers by the process of removing water and then joining the monomers together. So this is it's a short chain, but it's a two-member chain. Here's one subunit, here's another, and there's a hydrogen on the end of it. This is my third subunit, which has an OH or hydroxyl attached to it. This is my water right here that comes off of the reactants. And now the product is dehydrated, if you will. It doesn't have as much water. So we call this dehydration synthesis, and water is a byproduct. All of the organic macromolecules, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, are made in this manner by dehydrating the reactants, taking water out of the reactants. Also, when any organic macromolecule is broken down in our bodies, the process occurs by the same type of chemical reaction. And this chemical reaction process is called hydrolysis. So hydrolysis means to split with water, or water to split. Lysis is to split. So you start with a long polymer. This particular polymer, I drew a long line, but this particular polymer only has 3 subunits. And these 3 subunits can be taken apart. Usually it starts at one end. Water is inserted, this bond is broken, and so you get one monomer coming off. So water has actually been sort of added to the ends of the 2 products. Okay, so there's 4 groups of organic macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. They're all considered polymers, and they're all made up of individual subunits, which we generically call a monomer. But of course, each category has a different type of monomer. But once you learn to recognize these monomers, a visual picture like we did with the functional groups, you'll know right away what type of compound or macromolecule a larger compound is. You'll know what you're looking at. If you can recognize the monomers, you'll be able to tell a carbohydrate from a protein, from a nucleic acid, and from a lipid. So all carbohydrates are composed of more than one monosaccharide. So that's the monomer, a monosaccharide, for carbohydrates right here. Proteins are made up of monomers called amino acids. Nucleic acids are made up of monomers called nucleotides. And polymers are made up, lipids are made up of monomers called fatty acids. But I have to tell you that there is some variability in this concept with lipids. For example, cholesterol is just one unit. It doesn't have multiple monomers, but we'll come back to that later. So let's look at some practical examples of these, because so far these are just terms that probably don't make much sense to you. So the top slide shows a carbohydrate. It's rather a complex carbohydrate in the sense that it's a long chain. And what I'm showing you is starch, usually found in plants. We have a kind of a form of a starch in our bodies, but it's not the same as what's found in plants. But notice there are repeating units that are linked together. Those are the monomers. And each one of those is a monosaccharide. In carbohydrates, monosaccharide monomers only have 3 elements. The 3 elements are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's it. You won't find anything else. No sulfur, no phosphate, no nitrogen, nothing. Just CHO. So the other thing that this picture shows you, which might be a little bit confusing to you, is that again they're showing an organic chemistry drawings to you before you've ever had organic chemistry, which is like not fair, right? And at every corner, once again, there's a carbon. So there's a carbon right there. At this corner, there's a carbon. Okay, I can't draw that small, but that's the carbon framework, is the ring. And coming off of the ring, you see functional groups, several hydroxyl groups. And that's what you'll see for every type of monomer or every type of monosaccharide in a carbohydrate, and you'll be able to tell that it's a carbohydrate right away. Now if we look at the bottom picture, this shows an example of a lipid. So category number 2, it's out of order, but a lipid. What this picture shows is a very common lipid known as a triglyceride. You've probably heard of blood work measuring people's triglyceride levels. Make sure they're not too high for the health of blood vessels. The carbon framework of this triglyceride is a backbone of 3 carbons. And those 3 carbons are shown in red. 1, 2, 3. And then each carbon is attached to a long chain, and it's a carbon-based chain called a fatty acid. So this is the fatty acid, and see, it's made up of tons of carbons and hydrogen bonds. This is what we call the repeating unit, because in a triglyceride there's 1 fatty acid, 2 fatty acids, 3 fatty acids. So that's what the tri stands for. So the monomer is a fatty acid and the polymer is a triglyceride. All of these carbon-hydrogen bonds are nonpolar, and so as you can imagine, a lipid like a triglyceride does not like water. It is hydrophobic. Okay, then the third group, proteins. Again, we have a chain of monomers linked together to form a polymer. Sometimes proteins are called polypeptides, poly meaning many, and I guess peptide because the bond between amino acids is called a peptide bond. But we'll come back to that again later. So each one of these individual monomers is called an amino acid. There's some letters on these balls. I see that. ALA, VAL, SER. That's an abbreviation for which amino acid it is. Alanine, valine, serine. There's many different amino acids. But all of the amino acids that make up a protein have a similar structure. And that is that they will have a central carbon, and then they will also have a carboxyl group, which that wasn't very good, but that's a carboxyl group over here on this end, and an amine group, a hydrogen, and some sort of attached side group. So you always look for the presence of both an amine group and a carboxyl group. That's what an amino acid looks like. And lastly, the last bit of new information is that nucleic acids also are considered polymers. They are complex molecules made up of individual nucleotides. Now, nucleotide structure is a little complex for this short lecture. There's a separate one for that, so I'm not going to go into that too much. But nucleic acids include things like DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So DNA. Deoxyribo is D, nucleic N, acid A. And there are repeating monomers in both sides of this double-stranded DNA molecule. Here's a subunit, here's a subunit, here's a subunit, here's a subunit, then I kind of have to go up here. But there's repeating units, and each one of those are called a nucleotide, which we'll talk about in a separate lecture. Okay, the last thing that we want to look at today is see if you can talk to me a little bit, or talk to yourselves, I guess, a little bit about how organic compounds are made. And that is through dehydration synthesis. So I'm wondering if you can recognize which of the reactions, one in each box, is dehydration synthesis. Is dehydration synthesis shown in the box on the left or on the right? And the answer is the right box, because of course you put two smaller units together to make a large unit. Okay, that's your introduction to organic molecules. We'll go through each one individually again in case that was just, way too rapid. Thank you.